That's faith in the sense of what? Now that I have set the stage, let me point out something you may not have seriously considered up to this point in time. It is completely impossible for anyone to believe nothing at all. That is true, simply because what you know depends on what you believe to be true. That being the case, everyone believes something about God, even if they only believe He doesn't exist, and everyone who has heard about Jesus Christ believes something about Him as well. The trouble is, as both John and Paul stated, only those who choose to believe the truth that God has revealed in the Hebrew Scriptures regarding Jesus as His Majesty the Anointed One, are going to be saved. So listen up, you might learn something you really need to know. The story of how Jesus Christ came to be His Majesty the Anointed One begins in the first chapter of Genesis, which is an overview, nothing but a summary, of everything that God has in the past, and will in the future, accomplish in regard to the human race. The second chapter of Genesis is where the history of the human race actually begins. As I explained in the booklet, in the image and likeness of God, the second chapter of Genesis tells us our forefather Adam was created on the third day of creation, before the fish and birds were created on the fifth day of creation, and all the other animals were created on the sixth day of creation. Then God created Eve on the sixth day of creation, after He finished creating all the animals. Those things are easy to understand and beyond dispute, unless one desperately wants to hold on to the ridiculous notion that the man mentioned in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, is our forefather Adam. In which case, arguing with them on the basis of logic is futile. Dim lights like that will readily go on believing God was somehow able to create our forefather Adam, both before and after He created the animals. Don't ask me how any rational person can believe that nonsense. It makes no sense at all to me, but I can tell you it proves they have never been born again. If they had, the Holy Spirit within them would be absolutely shouting at them, confirming to the truthfulness of the things that I presented in the little booklet titled, In the Image and Likeness of God. Believe that, if you care to, disbelieve it if you dare to. It makes not one whit of difference to me one way or the other. I am merely doing what God called me to do. Enough sarcasm. The next thing you need to know and believe is what Moses states only cryptically in the third chapter of Genesis. Genesis chapter 3, verses 14 and 15, my interim translation. Then His Majesty, God, said to the serpent, because you did this, you are irrevocably cursed more than all the beasts, and more than all the animals of the field. You will walk on your underbelly, and you will eat dust all the days of your life. But I will put a mutual hatred between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He will bruise you on the head, but you will bruise him on the heel. The Church has long believed verse 15 refers to Jesus Christ, and it does, but the Lord told Adam and Eve a whole lot more about Jesus Christ than what is stated in that one verse. That bit of insight surfaces in this verse. Genesis chapter 4, verse 1, my interim translation. Then the Adam knew his woman Eve, and she got pregnant, and engendered Cain. And she said, I have acquired a man, His Majesty. Look it up. That is what that verse actually says. And what Eve said speaks volumes concerning her mindset. She knew perfectly well that a virgin whom she mistakenly assumed was her would conceive and bear a son, who would be none other than God Himself. Where did she get that information? She got it from the things that God told Adam, right before He booted them out of the garden. I say that because it becomes obvious from things that Moses tells us later on, that God gave Adam and Eve a promise, and told them to hand it down to the next generation with instructions, that it was to be handed down from one generation to the next as an inheritance, in the form of an oral blessing, until the time came when God finally fulfilled the promise, and bestowed on Jesus Christ what was promised. That is what the Apostle Paul says in the following passage, where he implies the gospel message already existed, before the patriarch Abram came to be the heir of the promise who held title to the promise. Galatians chapter 3, verses 6 through 9, my standardized translation. You are just like Abraham. He believed the living God, and it was reckoned to him as a declaration of not guilty. So then you know that those who are children on the basis of belief in God's promise, these individuals are Abraham's sons. But when the Scripture saw beforehand that the living God was going to acquit the Gentiles, on the basis of belief in God's promise, it proclaimed the good news of the fulfillment of the promise earlier to Abraham, that all the Gentiles will be blessed in you. So then those who are believers on the basis of belief in God's promise, are going to be blessed along with Abraham, the one who believed God's promise. Granted, Paul's statement regarding the promise is a bit convoluted, since he claims the Scriptures said things to Abram before they were written. But his point is, the Scriptures talk about the promise being handed down, prior to the time when God told Abram, he was the heir of the promise through whom the Gentiles would be included. My point is, the promise came out of the garden with Adam and Eve, and it was handed down as an inheritance that was conveyed via an oral blessing, until it came into the possession of Abram. That line of succession becomes the focal point of the biblical account in the 5th chapter of Genesis, which begins with this misunderstood statement. Genesis chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, my interim translation. This is the scroll of Adam's engenderings. In the day when God creates Adam, he will make him in the likeness of God. He will create them male and female, and he will bless them, and he will call their name Adam, in the day when he creates them. One could easily take those two verses to be referring to our forefather Adam, but that would be a huge mistake, since we already know the Adam mentioned in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, is Jesus Christ. The truth is, Moses is letting us know in those two verses, that the purpose of the scroll he is writing, is to give us the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the second Adam, the Adam that Paul mentions in the following passage. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 35 through 49, my standardized translation. But someone will say, how are the dead going to be raised? And then in what kind of body are they going to come? Fool! What you sow is not going to be given life if it does not die. And whatever you sow, you do not sow the body that will come to be, but a naked grain, whether it obtains the body of wheat, or of one of the rest of the seeds. And then the living God gives it a body just as he wants, and to each of the seeds, its own body. All flesh is not the same flesh, but there is in fact, one flesh of men, and then another flesh of animals, and then another flesh of winged creatures, and then another flesh of fish. There are also bodies in heaven, and bodies on earth. But the glory of the bodies in heaven is in fact different than the glory of other bodies in heaven, and then their glory is different than the glory of the bodies on earth. There is one glory of sun, and another glory of moon, and another glory of stars, for one star matters more than another star in glory. So also the resurrection of the dead. It is sown with a perishable body, it arises with an imperishable body. It is sown with dishonor, it arises with glory. It is sown with infirmity, It arises with supernatural power. It is sown a soulish body. It arises a spiritual body. If there is a soulish body, there is also a spiritual body. It has even been written this way: the first man Adam was turned into a living soul, the last Adam into a spirit that gives life. But the spiritual man is not first, but the soulish man, then the spiritual man. The first man is out of earth made of dirt, the second man is out of heaven. The man made of dirt is of such a sort, that those who are made of dirt are also like this one, and the man in heaven is of such a sort, that those who are in heaven are also like this one. And just as we have worn the image of the man made of dirt, we will also wear the image of the man in heaven. It should be obvious that Paul is talking about the two Adams that Moses mentions in the creation account. His point is, we all bear the image of our physical forefather at this time, but those who are saved will bear the same image that Christ bears when they are resurrected in the image and likeness of God. My only point in showing you what Paul said is the fact that he knew about the two Adams that Moses describes, and he was also aware that only the second Adam was created in the image and likeness of God. So much for the conventional wisdom that would have us all believe our forefather was created in the image and likeness of God. That ignorant misconception is bandied about everywhere today, so it must be part of the lie that Paul mentions in this passage. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, my standardized translation. So brothers, we are asking you to do something for the sake of the coming of our Master Jesus the Anointed One, and our assembling to him, so that you would not be quickly shaken out of your mind, or be alarmed, not even by a spirit, or by a word, or by a letter as if it were written by us, as though it is currently the day of his majesty. Do not let anyone dupe you in any way at all, that it may not be, that the apostasy must come first, and the man of the lawless one, the son of eternal damnation must be revealed, the one who is opposed to, and exalts himself over everything that is called a god, or object of worship, with the result that he sits down in the sanctuary of the living God, presenting himself as convincing evidence that he is God. Do you not remember that I was telling you these things while I was still with you? So you are aware of what is holding him fast now, so that he can be revealed in his own time. For the mystery of the lawless one is already working in them, the one who is only holding them fast at this time, until he comes out of their midst. And then the one who is lawless will be revealed, the one whom his majesty Jesus will put away by the spirit of his mouth, and abrogate by the appearance of his coming. The one whose arrival is in accordance with Satan's energy, with all supernatural power, and signs, and wonders, lies, and with all the deceitfulness of immorality for those who are going to be done away with, because they did not accept the love of the truth, so that they could be saved. So for this reason, the living God will send them a deceptive energy, so that they believe his lie, so that all who did not believe the truth but were delighted with his immorality, can be judged. My point is, if you do not know about the two Adams mentioned in the first two chapters of Genesis, you are certainly not going to understand what Moses says after that, and you are going to end up believing a lie. Trust me, Moses had a purpose in writing the things he wrote, and that purpose comes up front and center in the first two verses of Genesis 5. Genesis chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, my interim translation. This is the scroll of Adam's engenderings. In the day when God creates Adam, he will make him in the likeness of God. He will create them male and female, and he will bless them, and he will call their name Adam, in the day when he creates them. The Adam that Moses had in mind in those two verses is Jesus Christ. And the remainder of the Pentateuch, is an account of how God went about doing precisely what he planned. For that reason, Moses immediately begins tracing the lineage of Christ, confusing folks by referring to our forefather as Adam, right after he refers to Christ as Adam. Genesis chapter 5, verses 3 through 32, my interim translation. When Adam had lived 130 years, he engendered a son in his likeness, like his image, and he called his name Seth. And Adam's days after he engendered Seth were 800 years, and he engendered other sons and daughters. So all the days of Adam that he lived were 930 years. Then he died. When Seth had lived 105 years, he then engendered Enosh. Then Seth lived 807 years, after he engendered Enosh, and he engendered other sons and daughters. So all of Seth's days were 912 years. Then he died. When Enosh had lived 90 years, he then engendered Kenan. Then Enosh lived 815 years after he engendered Kenan, and he engendered other sons and daughters. So all of Enosh's days were 905 years. Then he died. When Kenan had lived 70 years, he engendered Mahalalel. Then Kenan lived 840 years after he engendered Mahalalel, and he engendered other sons and daughters. So all of Kenan's days were 910 years. Then he died. When Mahalalel had lived 65 years, he engendered Jared. Then Mahalalel lived 830 years after he engendered Jared, and he engendered other sons and daughters. So all of Mahalalel's days were 895 years. Then he died. When Jared had lived 162 years, he engendered Enoch. Then Jared lived 800 years after he engendered Enoch, and he engendered other sons and daughters. So all of Jared's days were 962 years. Then he died. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he engendered Methuselah. Then Enoch walked with God 300 years after he engendered Methuselah, and he engendered other sons and daughters. And all of Enoch's days were 365 years. And Enoch continually walked with God, and he was not, because God took him. When Methuselah had lived 187 years, he engendered Lamech. Then Methuselah lived 782 years after he engendered Lamech, and he engendered other sons and daughters. So all of Methuselah's days were 969 years. Then he died. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he engendered a son. And he called his name Noah, saying, "This one will cause us to feel sorrowful, because of what we have done, and because of the pain of our hands, because of the ground that his majesty irrevocably cursed." Then Lamech lived 595 years after he engendered Noah, and he engendered other sons and daughters. So all of Lamech's days were 777 years. Then he died. When Noah was 500 years old, Noah engendered Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Moses stops at Noah, because he is going to recount the occasion on which God decided to create a new Adam to replace the old one. He then says this. Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 8, my interim translation. So it was that the Adam began to increase on the surface of the ground, and daughters were engendered for them. And the sons of the living God saw the daughters of the Adam that they were good, so they took women for themselves from all that they chose. So his majesty said, My spirit will not adjudicate the case of the atom for a burning eternity. When they were influenced, he was flesh, so his days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and even after that. When the sons of the living God entered the daughters of the atom, they engendered sons for them. These were the Gibbors who were from a burning eternity, men of the name. When His Majesty saw that the bad behavior of the atom was more than enough on the earth, and everything formed in the thoughts of his heart was nothing but bad, the entire day, so His Majesty was sorry that He had made the atom on the earth, and He was grieved to His heart. Then His Majesty said, I will wipe the atom that I created, off of the surface of the ground, from the atom to beast, to crawling thing, and to the flyer of the sea of waters, because I am sorry that I made them. But Noah found favor in His Majesty's eyes. That passage means exactly what it says. God was sorry that He had created the first Adam, and He had already made plans to wipe his descendants off the face of the earth. He merely postponed the execution of His plan at that time, deciding instead to wait for an appropriate time to carry it out. If you didn't know that, you should probably read what the prophet Zephaniah wrote. The fire of the angry God of Israel is waiting in the wings, and it will be here in its own good time. If you don't believe that, just wait and see. When you see those nuclear clouds of God's glory, billowing up all over the earth, I have no doubt you will believe the things that God called me to explain, then. Won't do you any good, but you will believe. You probably already know the story, but you may not know all the pertinent details. When God destroyed all those folks back then, He spared Noah and his lineage. Then, when Noah came out of the ark on the other side of the flood, God promised He would never again destroy civilization with a flood. Nifty sleight of hand that one. He said nothing at all about doing it with fire. So everybody focuses on the covenant that God made with Noah, when He put the rainbow in the sky, and completely overlooked the passage with the most significance. Genesis chapter 9, verses 1 through 7, my interim translation. Then God blessed Noah and his sons, and said to them, Bear fruit and become many, and fill the earth. And an abject fear of you and trepidation of you will be on every animal of the earth, and on every flyer of the sea of waters, on everything that crawls on the ground, and on all the fish of the sea. They have been given into your hand. Every crawling thing that is alive will become foodstuff for you. Like the verdant vegetation, I have given everything to you. But you must not eat flesh with its soul, its blood. But also, I will diligently seek your blood for your souls, I will diligently seek it from the hand of every living being. But from the hand of the atom, from the hand of each of his brothers, I will diligently seek the soul of the atom. Anyone who sheds the blood of the atom, his blood will be shed by the atom, when he makes the atom in the image of God. But you must bear fruit and become many, you must reproduce on the earth and become many in it. The Adam that Moses mentions in that passage is Jesus Christ. It cannot be our forefather, simply because Moses never told us our forefather was created in the image and likeness of God. Anyone who wants to believe otherwise can only do so by clinging to the completely illogical notion that our forefather was created both before and after God created the animals. Lacking that insane ability, one should just relax and face the facts. Jesus Christ is the only Adam God has ever created in His own image and likeness. And the passage above, like Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, and chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, is referring to that Adam. What Moses says in regard to the shedding of his blood on the cross is not pertinent here, but you do need to keep the following in mind. The truth regarding the biblical account of God's decision to create Jesus Christ, the second Adam, in his own image and likeness is this. 1. Genesis chapter 1 is a summary overview of everything God has done with regard to his decision to create Jesus Christ in his own image and likeness. 2. Genesis chapters 2 through 4 explain some of the events that led up to God's decision to create Jesus Christ in his own image and likeness. 3. The first 2 verses of Genesis chapter 5 are an introduction to Moses' account of why God decided to create Jesus Christ in his own image and likeness. 4. Moses' account of why God decided to create Jesus Christ in his own image and likeness begins in Genesis chapter 5, verse 3, and goes through Genesis chapter 8. 5. Genesis chapter 9, verses 1 through 7, is a summary of God's announcement of his intention to begin the process of creating Jesus Christ in his own image and likeness.